Welcome everyone to the next roundtable discussion video. Today we have a very special guest with us. He is a colleague of mine. He is also my supervisor, and he's also a friend. His name is Japie Greeff. Japie, welcome to the roundtable discussion.
Thank you very much, Lance. I look forward to this.
Yes, I think it's going to be a great and fruitful endeavor. What we're trying to do is Japie and I have many discussions in our downtime. Sometimes when we grab coffee, we have very illuminating discussions with one another. And I think what we can try and do today is try and catch lightning in a bottle. Hopefully we get close to that, to the greatness we have behind the scenes. Maybe we can sort of let students get a view into that, and hopefully they can take something away from this. Okay, Japie, the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is tell us who you are, what you do, and how long you've been doing that for.
Okay, so as Lance said, I am Japie Greeff. I am the subject chair for computer science on the Vaal campus in the School of Computer Science and Information Systems. I also lecture artificial intelligence first at the NOF with astronomy, which definitely captured my imagination a bit. I then moved over into a number of startups where I worked as an electronic engineer, developing a variety of. And then towards the end of my industrial side of things, I worked at Dimension Data, where I developed, custom software, and then moved over to the university. And I've been here since 2017 and definitely enjoying it.
Okay, cool. What is your main field of interest? What is that thing that gets that fire lit up inside of you?
I think that's actually a very difficult question, to be honest, because it's something that definitely changes over time. So I think I would definitely say that serious games are an interest of mine. Using gaming for the kinds of purposes that are not just fun is definitely something that I think is worthy of study. I do enjoy philosophical tangents at points, and you and I have had some great conversations in that area. I like artificial intelligence and programming in general. Being able to build stuff from a perspective is something that I think is really interesting. And I enjoy. So yeah, and in terms of non-academic stuff, I would say I do enjoy watching television, movies and stuff, or things that definitely interest me. The occasional book doesn't hurt.
Excellent. All right. So today, the main framing device for this conversation we're about to have, we thought we'd focus on the academy and the university. In light of, fees must fall and the resurgence of that movement now, it's been 6 years where they've been relatively quiet on that front. And now suddenly we're seeing this resurgence in fees must fall and calls for decolonized quality education in South Africa specifically. We thought I'd maybe just start this conversation by just giving some background on the origins of the academy or higher education institutions as we know them today, starting with Plato and the ancient Greeks in 387 BC, then moving into the Middle Ages, the medieval times in Europe, where they started establishing sort of guild-based, very much religious institutions where they could sort of spread the word and teach people that way. And now moving into the more modern form of the university where we find ourselves now, I think this discussion is warranted and something that we can frame in terms of communication by saying that we live in a perfectly polluted information space. And I'm sure you will agree with me to some extent there. And I think that this has ramifications for everyone. I mean, especially the people now, you and I both work at the university, but obviously the students who are watching this as well. So what I want to know from you then, in looking at all of this and trying to untangle the mess of wires that are in front of us, why do you think, in your estimation now, people are so seemingly dependent on tertiary education? And why is it sort of seen as this be-all, end-all type of thing? It's like a zero-sum game in some instances to the public's view. That's my reading of the situation.
So, I think there's a number of reasons. I think actually that what makes these kinds of protests and problems so complex to try and solve is that there's actually a number of different things that you need to look at from a variety of points of view. Why tertiary education is seen as such a critical thing and why people actively want it. I think we can also look back at history. Schools, the way they are now, are a pretty recent invention. Up until maybe 100 years ago, it was more common to have single room schools and schools that only ran up to what would be equivalent to grade 8 now. And it's only as years have come on that the high school movement basically became relevant. And even when high schools started becoming prevalent, they weren't for everyone. This idea that everyone needs to have a high school diploma or a matric equivalency is a pretty new idea. And the reason that it actually progressed as it did over time is that the needs of industry and the kinds of work people were doing, maybe 200 years ago, it was perfectly sufficient to be a citizen that only had a grade 8 education, because the kinds of things you were working with didn't require much more than that. Whereas now, I would say that a high school diploma is no longer necessarily enough to get you a job in the kinds of industries that we face, both locally and internationally. So I think where we started, maybe 200 years ago, where primary school education would be enough, maybe in the 1900s, high school education would be enough. I think in the current milieu, it's definitely such that a tertiary education is almost critical for you to be able to take on the kinds of jobs that you are likely to find in industry.
But I agree with you. It's this market reaction to what industry requires. So saying, okay, we need this specific qualification in order for you to come and work for us. It's kind of a contractual agreement between industry and the education sector to say, okay, you've reached this rung of the ladder. Now the metaphorical doors open for you, to move into our space. But I think what we're seeing then is if the goalpost keeps shifting like that, what will it be? Will you eventually need a postdoctorate in order to go be a teller at Checkers?
I don't think it's those kinds of jobs that are necessarily the drivers. But I mean, if you look at specifically artificial intelligence, there are a number of positions out there, especially if you look at companies like Google, that require you to have a PhD, where that is the minimum entrance requirements. So I think that these goalposts being shifted is absolutely something that has happened. I think just having a degree at the moment is definitely useful, but in many situations, I would say a master's degree is a lot more useful, if only because it's generally in your master's where you would actually take on a project of sufficient scope to kind of flex your muscles and put all of your knowledge into practice. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think, I don't know if it would be, the teller at Checkers that necessarily needs a degree. But I would say if you look at the number of programmers, for example, that are needed in industry, and there, it's generally accepted that a degree is the barrier to entry there. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and I think those kinds of jobs are just becoming more mainstream, whereas maybe 20 or 30 years ago, being a programmer put you in a very small niche group of maybe even engineers. Mm-hmm. Whereas now it's become a field that it's huge.
Mm-hmm. So then this is the biggest question I think I've prepared for you, but in your view, what should the function of the universities then be if we're being this reaction to marketplace and industry requirements? In your view, if you could shape this to be whatever it could be what you want, what would you think the function should be of the university or the academy?
So, I mean, if you look at the kind of historical situation, I mean, I think that's called the Rogers Report from about the 1960s in the UK, where they actually very intense investigation to try and understand what is the role of the university, what function does it serve, and the end result of that report was that universities are supposed to generate knowledge, they're supposed to keep knowledge and actually keep it safe and organized, and they should disseminate that knowledge. And for a very long time, I think that has been the model that has been prevalent in many universities worldwide. I think now, however, where in the 60s it was really important for the university to keep that knowledge and to be a repository, I think the internet has now become that repository for us. So we no longer need to keep knowledge the way we did maybe in the past. And I think the role of the university is going to have to be one that tries to bring about innovation rather than just the regurgitation of facts. Because at this point, I mean, it's really easy to get simple facts off of the internet just using a smartphone. So actually teaching people, the techniques of actually solving problems and to instill a spirit of innovation is the kind of thing that a university should now actually be focused on a lot more than what they were maybe in the past.
And how do you think we would get to that place for it to be this driver of innovation?
I think you and I have actually had a couple of conversations around this, but I think this actually comes down to that dividing line between school and university. Because, and I think even yesterday we had this conversation, but there is an element of the university which really is just an extension of school. Like in your first year, it's different to what it was, but it's still very much a pedagogy-driven situation. Whereas as you get older and as you reach maybe your third year, I think there should be a much greater focus on the kind of person that you're going to be after your degree. And I think what universities need is to change the way they teach things, especially at the exit level. But I also think that, and this is not just locally, but also internationally, the number of people that are achieving postgraduate degrees, so master's and PhD degrees, is going up and up and up. And where previously, the main reason that you would get a PhD was really so that you could become a teacher at a university or a lecturer at a university. I think those sorts of programs need to become more focused on generating knowledge that is actually useful to society in general, rather than that kind of blue sky research that was done maybe in the university. So I think a focus on more applied research would definitely benefit the university and the students in general.
So they're more useful to mankind type of approach to get your legs to get your legs into the communities and help out where possible. Because I think you and I both understand that we need to focus more on our immediate environments because of this perfectly polluted information landscape. It's best to sort of plug into what's happening in your immediate environment, because then we can start addressing these issues. And I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right on the money there. Now, a big question for you is primary education a human right?
Lance, I think I lost you there.
Okay, cool. Am I back?
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, yes, cool. Right. So is primary education a human right in your view?
Yes. I would definitely say primary education should be. I think everyone should be entitled to that.
Mm-hmm. And what about higher education then?
I think to a certain extent we are getting to the point where it should be. I think primary school and high school is already something that we recognize as important for our citizens. I think we're definitely rapidly getting to the point where some sort of tertiary education, needs to be given to people at a price that they can afford, regardless of their background. I think that one of the problems we face is that a lot of students just see the traditional universities as an option. And I think that's where a lot of our problems lie, is that we've neglected things like the TVET colleges, and even to a lesser extent, the universities of technology. I think it's crucial for us to actually embrace all forms of tertiary education, rather than just having this very narrow focus that we've got at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Because part of the historical development of the academy was initially these were institutions that built researchers and scholars, like you alluded to earlier. I mean, it was very much the colleges and the technical institutions where you would learn skills, artisan skills, like becoming a mechanic or a plumber or an electrician, and things of this nature, that we've seen the demand for these types of jobs is something that, it's kind of like being a teacher. It's one of those jobs that never really goes away, and it's in demand everywhere you go in the world. So I think you're right there. I think another thing you and I have spoken about is this perception that university is just an extension of school. It's school number 3. And I don't know. I know you and I both agree that that is the perception we're seeing from students. But how do we disrupt that kind of view, that perception? How do we change that perception?
I think that's something that also needs to come from the students, to be honest, because there is I think the split between pedagogy and andragogy. So pedagogy being the teaching of children, andragogy being teaching of adults. One of the things that sort of differentiates those two approaches is the amount of personal responsibility that the student will take. So the more kind of self-driven learning, where you could give information and expect the student to go study themselves and to understand a fair chunk of the information themselves, that transition maybe needs to happen a bit earlier than what is happening at the moment. I think people call it spoon feeding. And I think for maybe the first year of your university education, there should be an element of spoon feeding because it is very different to what you're used to at school. But I think from the second year, you should have, the ability to actually, direct yourself and actually gain knowledge without someone explicitly telling you every piece of knowledge that you need to learn. So whether it's school number 3, I think an element of it is. I think definitely in the first and to a certain extent the second year, it's kind of like school. You're not necessarily expected to bring a full critique of a theory or anything of that extent. But yes, I think somewhere between the first and the third year there needs to be a change. You need to start seeing yourself more as a potential worker or professional in a field, rather than just a student at a university. And that mindset shift, I think that needs to come from the students and the student body as a whole, because I think a lot of this is also influenced by your peers. So how other people perceive the class is going to be, to a great extent, how you perceive the class. So I think if you force students to act like adults, I think many of them are perfectly capable of doing so. But it's not necessarily always the way that things actually get taught.
But is it sort of a bigotry of low expectations here, because we're not allowing people to undergo this paradigm shift and to start taking personal responsibility? Is it who's most at fault in that?
I think to a certain extent it's almost become part of the the process of commercializing universities. One of the sort of, and it actually came up on a TED talk I watched quite recently, specifically looking at the future of universities, where, maybe 30 years ago, you would go into a classroom and someone would say, the professor up front would say, look, right, of the 3 of you, only one of you is going to pass this course. And for a long time, that was the kind of thing that was prevalent at universities, very low pass rates with very complex concepts being covered. I think by trying to push up pass rates, you naturally lower the standard, not on purpose, but at a certain extent, we have lowered the standards a fair bit to make sure that enough students pass. And that is much more like the schooling system, where the expectation at school is that 90 or 95% of your students are actually going to pass. So I think that by making it such that more people can get a university degree or a first degree, it's made it harder to actually sort of put in place that mindset shift. Where it is very relevant is in something like honors, your first postgraduate degree. There is a much greater focus on taking responsibility and actually interrogating ideas at a much. And I think what's going to happen is that the undergraduate degree is going to become more and more and more like school, and the postgraduate system is going to become more and more what the university maybe was 200 years ago, with that being the place where to interrogate ideas.
Could you envision a split between the university then? One that's purely based on pedagogy, extension of school, bridging towards postgraduate, and then having a facilities exclusively for postgraduate learning? Do you foresee something like that happening?
So, I mean, if countries like the UK, they already have universities that are, or at least colleges that are dedicated only to masters and postgraduate study. And I think that is going to be the kind of thing that, to a certain extent, I think it's already in place in universities. If I look at NWU, we, for example, have the research entities. And a research entity is populated with professors that are there, but also masters and PhD students, where the entire focus is on research and doing work that is critically thought out, following research methodologies, all of that nice researchy stuff. So yes, I think that split is already partially in place, where the schools inside the university actually handle the undergraduate teaching, and the research entities take over that role of the teaching of masters and postgraduate students.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense to me. It's one of those things where the viewers now watching will get to know this a lot. Is I'll bring up something and you will say, but that's already here. That's the fun part of working in tech and in our school specifically. So that's something that will happen a lot. What I've noticed though on Twitter, you speak about the sort of peer pressure, your peers kind of influencing these, like the stirring of emotions and pushing us into certain directions. I saw a tweet, when was it? This morning actually. It was at Marty's, and it was students were kind of taking over the student facilities. It was like a cafeteria, and they were forcing students who were busy studying to sort of join them and get in on the act. So I think it's something we very much see, even in Braamfontein now. I saw an article this morning that they had like heavy, high-powered rifles and things like this. So I just want to get your sort of view of this as a revolution of sorts, or is this something that's only politically expedient? Why is there such a loud call for free decolonized education in our country?
So, I mean, I think that's a very complex question. I definitely think that it depends on what point of view you're coming from. But I think that the call for decolonization has quite a long history associated with it. Not in South Africa necessarily, but I mean, writers on published work. I mean, I think that's probably a good 50 years ago now, where there was a push for decolonization in higher education institutions. I think the reason that we are currently seeing the amount of resurgence of that fees must fall, what's the word? Energy, is just that with the COVID pandemic being what it is, students are coming to university with a dream. And maybe 20 or 30 years ago, you had the opportunity to get a good job with just a matric. But shrinking of the economy and the number of jobs we've lost has just made it so much harder for students to see a future for themselves without tertiary education. And with the announcement made by President Zuma that tertiary education should be free, I feel like a lot of students have been made a promise that just wasn't kept by government. And I think they're just trying to claw back to that point. Whether university can be free is a difficult question. I mean, it's the South African economy at the moment, I don't think can necessarily support it, but I do think that there needs to be a change of some description to support students coming from a variety of backgrounds to get that first degree. I definitely feel like that's something that's necessary. And yeah, I mean, I think the students that we also have, they've grown up in South Africa, and South Africa is a country that protests. We have, massive protests. Protests become violent very quickly. So I think it's just with the way that they've been raised and the kinds of things they've been exposed to, I feel like many students feel this is the only option they have to actually voice their concerns. And to some extent, I think that is true. Writing letters and peaceful protest doesn't necessarily get you very far in South Africa. So I think, whether there's a political element to it as well, I think that there's definitely a political element. But just because there is one doesn't mean that the complaints from students aren't necessarily valid.
Mm-hmm. So what, in your estimation, is what would a redress of this nature look like? What would free decolonized education look like? Let's zoom in on our school specifically. Is there any aspects you could imagine that being or looking like?
So yes, I mean, I think the decolonization narrative is actually interesting, on its own merit. I think this is something you and I have discussed quite a lot. But I think one of the problems with the way the decolonization sort of movement is going is that there's a very big focus on dismantling things, on breaking things, on removing knowledge from the system. I think a better way of doing it would be changing the knowledge that is brought about, but supplementing it with locally relevant knowledge. If I look at our school being computer science and information systems, it's very difficult to break away from the knowledge inside of the curriculum, because if you can't program, then you're not a programmer. Why would you do that degree? So any degree in computer science that doesn't have a large element of computer science in it is obviously going to be detrimental to the student. But look at the way a lot of foreigners are employed in the gig economy, where companies would outsource programming work to India, China, Malaysia, where programmers are very cheap. That can only happen in English if you've got this common language of interaction. If you've got an African language, however, that means that you can write apps for an African market, and that market will essentially be protected simply because you're speaking a language that people in other countries aren't speaking. Mm-hmm. So you can decolonize the curriculum by actually flowering, these kinds of apps and software that is meant for the South African market, because that will strengthen your opportunity to get a job in the South African market, as opposed to a process where you try and break it down and remove elements, inherently making you less employable, especially in the international space.
I think, that's right on the money. In this module specifically, we talk about paradigms of human interaction. And those are your lose-win, win-lose, lose-lose, and sort of win-win situations, right? Those are the paradigms of human interaction. And I think what you're talking about now is a reframing of decolonization, and seeing the word de as a prefix immediately conjures images of let's take away, let's remove, let's dismantle, as you said. Where I think what you're talking about is a third alternative, which is that win-win. So looking at better alternatives, looking at different pathways to get knowledge to where it needs to actually go. I think that's a really positive way of looking at this topic, because I think so often, even in academic articles I've read, it's always very much a taking away. It's a subtraction of straight white men authors, whatever it might be, whatever it's framed as. But I think there's much potential for us to inject new methods and methodologies into this practice that I think could benefit everyone.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think
supplementing the knowledge that is there.
That's the word.
If I use the example, that you put forward at the beginning of our discussion here, where the academy kind of started with the Greek philosophers. Mm. And then you jump over to the Middle and Arabian countries, which kept a lot of that knowledge alive when Europe was in complete and utter shambles. So there's this whole section of history in Africa of the academy that is very rarely spoken of. And I think those are the kinds of things we should be highlighting in a decolonized curriculum, is to not just break down the structures that are there, but to recognize the work that's actually done in Africa that is useful and beneficial to the field, and just putting an emphasis on that. So it's not about removing, the stuff you don't like necessarily. It's just about adding in the stuff that is relevant and, that should be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we spoke to a prof in the indigenous knowledge systems last year, And he very much says people have this misperception about indigenous knowledge systems because they think it's all Africanization. But what it is using these alternate schools of thought and including them in the vast array of knowledge in that corpus, which I think was a very positive thing for me to find out, because again, it does sound like something that might be very one-dimensional in its approach. So I think what we're speaking on now represents this fees must fall movement and this desire for a difference, for change, extends beyond just education. I think we're looking at cultural facets, we're looking at political things as well. And I think it goes to this question now. With tech, how do you think tech is going to influence the direction of universities as we go forward? Because my wife's very much involved with making artifacts and things in education, and they're talking about, they're called MIC kiosk. So MIC fundi, this is this idea for a kiosk where you can go and check your fundi and stuff, and it's all wired into the infrastructure at the university. These cool kind of pieces of tech we can interface with and could potentially, address some of these issues that students are having. What is your reaction to that?
I think it's one of those things that is already here. And I think even the concept of having, a learning management system is a pretty recent idea. Just having these sites that are dedicated to each subject, where, maybe even 10, 15 years ago, you would get your study guide as a printed manual, and then you would buy notes from the department, and everything would be handled in paper. Now, students have access to their learning management system 24/7. They've got their lecturer on email or WhatsApp, especially now under these COVID conditions. Having access to your lecturer outside of just the classroom time, I think, has become more prevalent than it was in the past. Mm-hmm. So, yes, I think universities will be shaped by technology in as much as they embrace technology. I think there's still many universities that will be left behind. Slow, laborious, elephants that take a while to change direction. But there are so many opportunities that come forward now with newer technology. I think it's a bit of a cliche thing to discuss, but the fourth industrial revolution is here. And what's going to be very relevant to universities in the near future and even now is trying to understand what kind of jobs students are going to be prepared for, because the working world is definitely changing. And I'm not sure if at the moment degrees are keeping up with the rate of change that is still in the market.
And this is exactly when we talk about those gentlemen on YouTube who make those very complex, nuanced lectures that people can access for free. Then what does that say about something like a university where, in my estimation, we should be building and shaping communities where it's very much a win-win for all stakeholders involved. So I think unless we adapt and change, like you say, become innovation driven and community based, I think that unless we do that, I don't know if there will be a university in 100 years' time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's exactly it's that applied research, because there are universities that are dedicated to blue sky research and trying to understand the natural world, and some elements of the university should be that. There should be funding made available for the kind of research that takes us forward. Otherwise, if we're only doing applied research, we'll pretty much grind to a halt. So that blue sky research does need to be there. But in terms of the teaching and learning experience, I think it's more useful to reuse content from the international space as a baseline, and then using the university to give the context information to students for their specific context. And I think that gap is where the university is going to be able to flourish, is trying to take this general knowledge, which you can get freely off the internet, and make it applicable to the context that you're actually teaching. I think it's very difficult to do.
Yeah.
But that is, I think, the way to make it go forward.
Yeah, that often seems like putting a round peg into a square hole.
Yeah.
But then talking along those lines, then you're very much focused on artificial intelligence and AI and this field of study. Do you see any affordances or special affordances that this realm could potentially hold for, higher education and the academy?
Absolutely. As with all technology, I think it's something that you can employ to try and make things better for the teaching and learning experience. One of the things that we've actually done to try and just play around with it from an employment point, we wrote a system to basically tag technology that is in job applications or job listings. So trying to look at or relevant in the Gauteng and Northwest area programmers and tagging it with the different technologies that are relevant, and then using artificial intelligence to create a sort of basket of skills that students can actually use or employable. That would just be one example, but there are other examples of automated testing and assessment things. Actually extracting information from textbooks to actually make automated summaries. There's almost no end of where artificial intelligence can actually make the teaching and learning experience better. Whether it's substantially better to having a personal experience with a lecturer, I think is up for debate. A tutor that is an artificial intelligence chatbot is going to give you an inherently different experience to something that is personal in the form of a lecture. So I don't think lectures will disappear, but I think that lecturers who don't pay attention to technologies, like, for example, artificial intelligence, run the risk of making themselves obsolete very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just seeing things built into the LMS, such as, secure online examinations. I mean, we're starting to see, I heard our marketing team talking about an NW app where there will be facial recognition and all this kind of stuff, which is very much in that wheelhouse. But I agree with you, unless you're very privy to what's going on, especially in your immediate environment, I think you might fall behind or lag to a point where it's just inefficient. So I think we can begin wrapping up. I just want to ask you, where do you think we go from here? Where does the academy go after this whole discussion? Where do you think we're headed? Are we headed to dystopia or utopia?
So I think it's going to depend very much on what our reaction is after the COVID pandemic. At this point in time, so many things are kind of up in the air. And I think a lot of plans have stalled, a lot of big research projects have stalled, just because everything, the kind of whole world is holding its breath at this point in time. And it's shown us that we're able to work in a new normal. So the way the university has functioned for the last year is completely different to what it was doing maybe 5 years ago. And I think that once this pandemic is actually away, or has kind of left us, the university that emerges from that is going to depend. It's going to basically predict whether we win or lose. I think a university that can't reintegrate these things that were learned from the online teaching and learning experience into their new way of teaching, if they can't do that, I think they run the risk of not being relevant anymore.
Perfect. Nice and succinct.
And I think creating those keys for innovation, especially in the South African context, knowing now, what the impact of COVID was on our economy. It's one of those things where they say, crisis and opportunity are often, quite closely linked to each other. So there are so many businesses that closed down during the pandemic, which has left, big open holes in the economy that can be filled by new businesses. And I think if we have a sufficient focus on innovation and entrepreneurship and critical thinking, we can fill those gaps in the market with new companies that are embracing the kinds of technologies that we're seeing in the fourth industrial revolution. I mean, people talk about leapfrogging, where you can skip over a number of kind of industrial steps with a newer technology, which can actually put you ahead of established companies, because they would still need time to change their way of doing things to a newer technology.
Mm-hmm.
So this market that is as open as it's going to be at the end of the COVID pandemic, I think we need to jump on that very effectively.
Yeah, I think that response is it's vital. But I'd like to ask you then, what would your message be to perhaps a second-year student who's watching this, who is demoralized, in the face of this pandemic, and hasn't been able to see friends or whatever the case might be? What would you tell them in their academic career, maybe as words of encouragement or wisdom? What would you say?
Dan. So do you see it more as a school where you would just learn things passively and regurgitate facts, because that is one way of looking at it? Or do you see it as an opportunity for you to try and interrogate more complex ideas, and you actively lecturers to try and understand these things at a deeper level? Or do you see it as a networking event? Because, many people have started very successful companies as university dropouts, simply because by being at university, they have the opportunity to network with other fairly smart people. And if you get smart people in the room and they collaborate, often really good ideas can come from that. So I would say that as a second-year student, should really actively be thinking, why am I here? And what do I want to get out of this experience? What are my expectations? And then trying to make sure that you shape your educational experience around you to be exactly that. Because you have a lot more say in university than you did maybe at school. Spoken
like a true pragmatist, Japie. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking part in this discussion. I really appreciate you taking the time to do it. I'm sure the students are going to love hearing your perspectives. So thanks, Jables.
That's a pleasure, Lance. Anytime.